Hello, I'm Stephen Bernstein, Global Chair of McDermott Health. I'd like to welcome our regular listeners to our Governing Health podcast series, in addition to those of you listening to us for the first time. Each month, our partner, Michael Peregrine, welcomes a new guest into the studio to discuss some of the most pressing matters facing boards of directors, with particular focus on health and life sciences organizations. On behalf of the Health Practice Group at McDermott, it's a pleasure to have you join us.
Hello again and welcome. I'm your host, Michael Peregrine. We're pleased to have you with us. Today's conversation focuses on a matter of increasing concern to the board's portfolio. The expectation that as part of its core responsibilities as to financial statements, the Audit Committee will also monitor the potential for financial irregularity. That is, of course, assuming it has the time to do so. When it comes to preventing corporate scandals, regulators typically look to the board as the first line of defense. This is especially the case in the nonprofit sector, where there's no market factor to provide additional oversight and protection. And it's in this context that the board's Audit Committee offers particular value. Amongst its many roles is the general expectation that it will be attentive to the warning signs of fraud, malfeasance, or gross mismanagement. And that expectation has been underscored of late by several emerging controversies in the nonprofit sector, including the New York State Attorney General's review of alleged conflicts at AMFAR, the Foundation for AIDS Research, and the Kentucky Attorney General's investigation of the University of Louisville Foundation. Without conflating allegations as fact, audit committees can learn much from the public record of these controversies. And to help us today in that regard, we have Scott Steffens and Dianne Wasieleski from Grant Thornton. Scott, who's an old-time friend, is an audit partner and represents a variety of nonprofit, healthcare, and professional services firms. Dianne is a senior manager in the firm's audit practice, specializing in nonprofit entities. And I would note that both Scott and Dianne have served on the audit committees of not-for-profit organizations. In our regular Looking Back segment, let's return for a moment to the subject of the evolving payment models in healthcare. This is much more than a discussion of the fate of the Affordable Care Act. As Dr. Toby Cosgrove recently noted, it's really about how healthcare companies will be required to restructure their entire operating model in order to effectively manage the transition from fee-to-service arrangements to a value-based payment model. It is an enormous transition. Pretty technical? Maybe. Just inside baseball? Not at all. The whole issue of the evolution in payment models goes to the heart of the board's responsibility for sustaining the long-term viability of the organization. It goes to the very core of what the board is supposed to do. The breadth of this evolution means increasing the board's homework assignment without a doubt, getting the board up to speed on the issues so the board can truly serve as an effective partner to management as it works to position the organization for sustained success. And given the other issues on the board's agenda, it's an issue that's probably coming at the worst possible time. But the board and executive leadership need to focus on how to increase the board's attentiveness to and awareness of payment model evolution. And now Scott Steffens and Dianne Wasieleski from Grant Thornton. Scott and Dianne, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Michael. Nice to be here.
Thank you.
Well, we're delighted to have you with us on the subject, as we were talking about before, I think is one of the most significant developments in the nonprofit sector in quite some time. We thought the best approach to these important issues is to focus on the allegations relating to the University of Louisville Foundation, since they're so relevant to issues that could arise in the healthcare sector generally. And in that regard, we're going to focus on the conclusions of a forensic audit of foundation activities released in midsummer that ultimately led to a state attorney general investigation. But before we begin our conversation, it's important to understand that we're still dealing with allegations. And to the best of our collective knowledge, there have been no civil or criminal actions filed in this matter so far. In addition, the foundation itself has undergone a significant reorganization of its staffing and structure over the last year. That must be noted. And this has nothing to do with the university itself and its relationship to the investigation of the basketball program. Scott, let's get started with an overview of what happened and how this all came to the surface.
Sure, Michael. This issue actually goes back to 2015. And as you pointed out, we're talking about the separate entity, the 501c3, which is the Louisville Foundation, and not the university itself. There were a series of items that came up that were brought to the attention of the Auditor General in the state of Kentucky. And they began an investigation that ultimately started under one investigator and then passed on to another that were the result of a series of concerns that were raised around overall governance of the foundation. A report was ultimately issued towards the end of 2016 that identified a number of items that were of concern to the auditor that then gave rise to the board of the foundation deciding that they needed to engage and hire an independent third party to ultimately do a more thorough investigation. That investigation, as you mentioned, was finalized in the summer of this past year, June of 2017. And that report laid out a number of allegations and observations with respect to overall governance at the foundation. And the findings really fell into a few areas that we'd summarize as follows: overall investments, overall governance, loans back and forth between related parties, some compensation issues, and also the use of donations and how monies were used that were received by the foundation from third parties. There also were some issues raised around technology and how information was protected, or in the case of the former president, not protected when he resigned. And even though this investigation did not specifically involve athletics, there were some issues around tickets back and forth between the university and the foundation, and how those tickets were not only used but also distributed based on contribution levels from various donors back and forth. So lots of items that are contained in this report. It's a very long report, but there's a lot of great lessons to be learned here.
Now, this also played out in the media over the last couple of years, didn't it?
Yeah. There were certainly a lot of attention from local media, both following the investigation. Once the media was aware of the state investigation, they got interested in trying to request some information under the Freedom of Information Act around compensation. And so there were a lot of parties that were looking to get information on this. And when the report ultimately was released, it was certainly picked up on by every media channel in the Louisville market.
And so we've got to also look at this in the context of reputational harm to the foundation, to its officers, to board members, and to the general university environment generally. Dianne, let's turn to the 2016 audit, a forensic audit. Could you first comment, just for those of us who are unfamiliar with accounting terms, the difference between a regular audit and a forensic audit? What are we focusing on there?
Yeah, a forensic audit, you're really focused on what went wrong. As opposed to a financial statement audit where we're looking from a materiality perspective, are the financial statements materially correct, and then opining an opinion on that. Forensic audit is much more in-depth, much more interview-based, as well as looking at specific emails and facts, similar to kind of something that you might do in a litigation type scenario.
I guess let me ask you a Grant Thornton question to both of you. When you're getting engaged in a forensic audit, what do you ask for in terms of support, cooperation, direction, guidance? What do you need from the client before you begin your work? Because I think this is an important consideration. Scott?
Sure. We certainly, when we begin forensic audits, we typically are, to start off, we're engaged by either outside or in-house counsel to protect the information, make sure that it's privileged, so that if anything is identified, it can be used if there was perhaps a need for a proof of claim, for example, of a loss. But generally, there's a need to have full and complete access to all information, both financial and operational, access to electronic data as well. And the process, generally it's evolving. So it starts with a premise that something went wrong, and then a determination of putting together a work plan to try to determine what went wrong, how it went wrong, and if there's a loss, to begin to quantify what that loss might look like. These type of investigations generally do take on a life of their own and do evolve over time, because it starts with perhaps a small allegation and other things are identified, and before it'd be looking at a number of different departments or a number of different types of expenditures that were beyond the thoughts of the initial scope.
Are you looking at numbers entirely, or are you conducting interviews as well? And if you're conducting interviews, are you doing that in consultation or together with the general counsel or outside counsel? How does that all work?
Yeah, so it is a combination of interviews and reviews of facts and figures. So there's a lot of analysis of data, looking for irregularities, analyzing ins and outs of numbers, proving out cash, for example, looking at bank statements. But then there are always questions back and forth with the interested parties where there'd be interviews both in a very protected way with counsel present if it was with someone that was the alleged perpetrator. But more often they're more casual for purposes of trying to get more full and complete facts from the people that are being talked to. So it really depends on the circumstances, but generally interviews are certainly part of the process.
Let's pivot for a moment to our regular short segment, What's Trending Now, when we try to flag a new governance issue we see on the horizon. And for me, that's the set of broad-based governance lessons learned from Weinstein and some of the related corporate controversies. They represent the best possible examples of the emerging best practice that has the board assuming responsibility for oversight of the workforce culture of the organization. The National Association of Corporate Directors recently released a white paper that details the expectations of the governing board with respect to culture oversight, including a series of very practical recommendations which should be studied by the board. And one clear aspect of this new responsibility is the expectation that the board will review its obligations with respect to sexual harassment by and of employees. Issues involving sexual harassment in the workforce increasingly require special board focus given the nature of the potential harm to all involved parties. The board needs to be aware of the legal obligations intended to protect both the victim and the accused in such instances. It's worth a briefing from the General Counsel to make sure that legally compliant policies are in place and communicated to all organizational constituents, and that complaints are processed accordingly. And now let's return to our conversation with Scott and Dianne about the University of Louisville Foundation and its impact on the Audit Committee. Well, Dianne, let's turn to the audit itself. 235 pages, something like that. A lot of trees were killed. Let's talk about the specifics. What did they find? What's of relevance here in terms of jumping off the page in terms of that forensic audit?
Yeah, I think that the main findings that we found that kind of hit home very heavily are surrounding good governance of the Audit Committee as well as the board. There were lots of factors within the report findings that talked about that maybe the Audit Committee didn't have the information readily available to them. They might not have had a good orientation process to get them acclimated with the complexities of the organization. And as we all know, sophisticated not-for-profits and healthcare organizations do have a lot of complexities in their organization structure. Another complexity that we saw in the report findings was as Scott mentioned earlier, the use of related party transactions. And to me, that goes back to the complexities of the organization and understanding the structure. To be able to really understand how those related party transactions are being accounted for and whether or not they're being appropriately disclosed.
We'll talk about that. That's, we're on the 15th anniversary of Enron and the mother of all related party transactions. Talk about the concept of related party transactions in the nonprofit context and how this arose within a foundation, because that may be scratching a few people's heads in that regard.
Yeah. Related parties from any organization is really looking at not just the entities that may be under your organization structure, but also looking at board members and what organizations are those board members involved with and what types of transactions are occurring between the foundation and the board members' personal organization. And there's a couple of ways that you could disclose those types of transactions and those types of relationships, and that's through conflict of interest statements that should be signed annually just as part of good governance and updated. And from that perspective, the foundation really needs to be cognizant of what those related parties are and how how in essence they interact with those agencies and become, vendors or customers or donors or what have you.
What were the ones we're focusing on here, Scott, in terms of the critical related party transactions?
Well, I think here, just a little bit of background, there are often very valid reasons for setting up related party organizations to perhaps separate different parts of the business. Maybe there's a real estate business, there's an investing business, and in the case here, what appears to have happened is that there were related party entities were created for the purposes of moving some real estate transactions and activities off the primary foundation's financial statements, but then where they would have appeared to have crossed the line is by also creating additional compensation opportunities for members of management who had multiple roles. So, for example, someone may have been the CFO of the primary foundation, but was also asked to be the on paper financial leader at these related party organizations, and there were what appear to be situations where additional compensation was created for these additional responsibilities that were taken on. And where it gets a little tricky is when there isn't a real good business purpose for setting up a separate entity. So in the case of the foundation, it would appear as though these additional entities were set up without not only perhaps good business purpose, but perhaps also without full knowledge of the board as to why they were setting this up, what the business purpose was, and making sure that there really was a reason to set up separate entities other than perhaps just to create additional compensation opportunities for some members of management.
Didn't one of the members of management push back and say, hey, don't pay me this money, I didn't earn it? Wasn't there some concern that there was an objection to the compensation program?
Yeah, exactly. There, and that was captured in an email exchange where there was a discussion about that additional compensation, and what was suggested by the email exchange was that it was being done for the sole purpose of being able to shield that additional compensation from Freedom of Information Act requests for compensation data of officers. And so you're right. One of the folks raised that they thought they might have been being paid too much money, and they were told, "Don't worry about it. This is why we're doing it." And we're told to, basically not bring it up again.
The Enron connection, the Enron relationship is just fascinating here. But that's a conversation for another day. Dan, let's go back. What are some of the other concerns that, with respect to the findings you had mentioned? I think the compensation issue. But what about investments and investing along with the organization? Can you talk about that a little bit?
So from an investment perspective, I think that the report found a couple of areas of concern. One being the foundation invested in various risky investments, which under certain circumstances is perfectly fine and a good fiduciary diversification of the portfolio. However, in this case, as alleged in the report, the investments were really focused on startup organizations, some of them with those related parties again. And part of the breakdown was where the foundation was withholding information from the board members, allegedly, or the audit committee to not be able to make appropriate fiduciary decisions on whether or not to continue to invest in those startup companies.
Which is a really irrelevant point, because we have in healthcare, especially with innovative technologies and investments, we have a number of organizations where board members are interested in investing along with the healthcare system in certain technologies and developments. And as you said, that can be totally illegitimate. The question is there an informed decision here? Are there controls in place and things of that nature? And it sounds like this was a major focus of the forensic audit.
It was, yes. And I think it's also working with the investment committee of the board as well to ensure that the investments are being made in accordance with the foundation's or the organization's investment policy.
Right, and along those lines, there were also some investments that were made in real estate that were non-income producing, and there too, to Diane's point, the portfolio was set up to generate a certain amount of income to produce scholarship dollars for University of Louisville students, and when a large portion of the portfolio, or at least a material amount, was being diverted to investments that weren't going to be income producing, that was going to impact the ability of the portfolio to earn its scheduled 7.5% return each year. So by taking some dollars out and investing in these real estate options, that certainly created a challenge. There also was a question of whether it really was a good idea for the foundation to purchase the golf course that the golf team had played on. There was some concern that course might be changing hands and the team might not have the ability to continue to play on it. So the foundation said that they would buy that golf course and that too may not have been the best investment of the endowment's dollars.
Interesting. In the nonprofit sector, there have been a number of recent issues with conflicts and investments involving the purchase and sale of golf courses. I don't know what that's all about, but there's a connection. We can have that conversation later too. As we wrap up, Scott, you're speaking to an audit committee, you and Dianne, and they're saying, what are the lessons learned? How did this happen? Where was the board? What are you thinking? How are you advising your clients in terms of the application of this situation to their typical facts and circumstances?
Sure. We've spoken to many audit committees about this case in particular and have said, if they'd like to just simply read the report, they can view it as, these are all the things not to do. So make sure you're doing the opposite of all the things that happen.
That makes sense.
Report.
Okay, I like that. Don't do this.
But if you don't have the time for 230 pages, I think it comes down to making sure there are good procedures in place around governance and that they're being followed. And that, most importantly, that there's enough time, allocated to talk about, these rather significant transactions and activities, particularly around related parties, and any type of, what I'd call, governance type activities that could have a negative impact on the reputation of a nonprofit organization. The one thing that audit committees often get very focused on is meeting with the auditors, receiving the report, and being done, and they view that as their only responsibility. But certainly an element of the risk side of an audit committee's responsibility would be to really make sure that they're asking the right questions and making sure that the right procedures are in place, they're consistently followed, and that the organization, not just the committee, is being transparent enough with these types of significant transactions involving investments, compensation, investments, and so on.
Well, the undercurrent of this scandal seems to be, though, that information wasn't getting to the board. How do you handle that issue when the committee would say, well, we're only reacting to what we get and we didn't know about this? Dianne, what's your advice?
That's a tough situation to be in because you might not have complete information to go off of and to make your decisions from. In these situations, I guess what I would think too, as an audit committee member, is really rely on and push your external auditors to help be your eyes and ears in some of those instances. Ask those probing and constructive questions of your external auditors to ensure that they're looking at the right things and that they're reporting back to you on the things that really matter, not just the normal required communications that auditors have to have each year.
Is that a private conversation or is that with members of the management team in the same room?
It might be a combination of both, actually. You can have some of those conversations in a special session just specifically with the auditors, and it might also be appropriate to have management in the room as well.
That's an excellent suggestion. Before we wrap up, kind of an open question. This goes when we push back from the table a little bit. The audit committee is clearly one of the most valuable committees to the entire board. They have a charter that's chock full. It's usually the longest charter per page of all the board committees. Scott, in your experience, is the audit committee being overburdened or is it already overburdened? And are these kinds of scandals going to happen in those situations?
I think that the things that audit committees are being asked to do as time goes on are only increasing, and it seems like the amount of time allocated for good, meaningful discussion is not increasing proportionally. The opportunity for the audit committee to have open and free access to the auditors, an internal auditor if one exists, to really understand overall risk assessment and to fulfill its responsibility takes a fair amount of time. And we have, in our experience, have had too many situations where committees try to do all that and get it done in a half hour and then move on to the full board meeting and not dedicate the right amount of time. My advice would be to take a good look at the charter, take a good look at the amount of time that's allocated, and make sure that the right amount of time is invested in these important risk areas to make sure there's time to ask the right questions, have the right dialogue with the outside auditors and with management to make sure that the committee can completely fulfill its responsibilities.
And Dianne, I guess the end of the story is to tell the committee, keep looking at what happens to the University of Louisville Foundation. This story may not be over yet.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Dianne, Scott, Grant Thornton, thanks so much for coming by today. We appreciate it, and this was a very valuable conversation.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
And there's also a late-breaking development as it relates to the role of the Audit Committee. It involves the controversy surrounding AMFAR, the well-respected charity focusing on AIDS research. The New York State Attorney General had reportedly been reviewing an intra-board dispute within AmFAR concerning a contribution arrangement between AmFAR, the American Repertory Theater, and, well, you guessed it, Harvey Weinstein. The nature of that arrangement has been the subject of substantial media attention. Now comes a New York Times report that the Department of Justice is conducting a criminal inquiry of the arrangement. Like the controversy with the University of Louisville Foundation, this development demonstrates the increasing willingness of state and federal regulators to protect nonprofit organizations from business arrangements that involve fraud, self-dealing, or similar concerns. As Dianne and Scott have just told us, recent controversies provide an excellent case study of how financial impropriety can arise within a sophisticated nonprofit and its leadership team. Regulators have taken notice too. So it's a topic that should be considered by the Audit Committee in the near term. Whether it has in place the kinds of controls, not just the compliance program, but other measures as well, that increase the likelihood that such impropriety might be identified by the organization. And of course, the more basic issue is making sure that the Audit Committee has the time and resources to implement such controls. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode of Governing Health. Be sure to subscribe to the full complimentary podcast series, which can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. There you'll be able to stay up to date with all of our future episodes and to re-listen to the old ones. Until next time, I'm your host, Michael Peregrine.
Copyright 2017, Thornton and Emery. All rights reserved. Any use of these materials, including reproduction, modification, distribution, or republication without the prior written consent of McDermott, and Emery, is strictly prohibited. This may be considered attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.